The Broncos had Thursday off of practice at the UCHealth Training Center as training camp is ongoing. They're back on the field Friday and Saturday before a trip to Minnesota next week for joint training camp practices. We talk about the Hall of Fame and our Broncos news and notes this upcoming week with Peyton Manning, John Lynch, and Steve Atwater getting inducted. Not to mention, we answer Broncos fans' questions in a special mailbag episode, all on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back into a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked On NFL Network, your team every day. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos analyst for the Locked On NFL Network and 9 News. You can follow me on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL. Make sure you follow Locked On Broncos on Twitter as well, at Locked On Broncos. Like us on the book face, and you can catch this podcast in audio format on all of your favorite audio podcasting platforms. If you want to watch us in video format, make sure you hit that subscribe button on the YouTube channel as we continue to grow things over here in video format. But with that said, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of news and notes to go over on today's episode of the show. Have a little bit of fun with Broncos fans. Training camp is grueling. You're going to see various storylines and narratives through the first couple of weeks. That's typical, and what we're seeing right now is par for the course, especially when it comes to this Denver Broncos football team. But there's a lot riding on this next week and a half because the Broncos, they are 9 days away from their first preseason game against the Minnesota Vikings. Next Saturday, we're going to have complete coverage and recap here on Locked On Broncos, but so excited that football is back. The Hall of Fame game between the Pittsburgh Steelers, Dallas Cowboys. Look, football, I'm telling you, there's something in the air. It's always a good feeling. But with that said, Broncos country, let's get into our news and notes. The Broncos have Thursday off at the UCL Training Center for practice, but they're back on the field on Friday and Saturday. You can catch continued coverage over here on the Locked On Broncos podcast, but some storylines. We continue to monitor the ongoing quarterback competition between Drew Lock and Teddy Bridgewater. We're analyzing how the running backs are doing with Melvin Gordon, Javonte Williams, Mike Boone, and even Royce Freeman making some plays in Broncos camp. And so it's really going to boil down to some tough decisions, I think, at the end of the preseason that this team is going to have to make regardless. So we're going to be keeping our eye on the standout players in preseason action, guys who may be safe, guys who the Broncos may release that they feel like they can claim on waivers afterwards to put onto the practice squad when the cuts from 80 to 53 do happen. But we're still about 3.5 weeks away from all of that even happening, so we got to manage what's right now with this team. As we mentioned, Friday and Saturday, padded practices once again at the UCL Training Center. Continue to monitor some storylines. Will we see Josey Jewell return at any point soon? Will he be ready by next week's joint practices against the Minnesota Vikings? Probably not at this point, not at least on Friday or Saturday, but we will see a little bit more Josh Watson, Justin Sternad, and some Curtis Robinson, the Broncos undrafted rookie free agent out of Stanford, getting some run both on the special team side and in the defensive rotation for this football team. So continue to see how maybe these young guys do. And I tell you what, I envision a little bit more and more an Alexander Johnson and Justin Sternad linebacking duo package actually isn't a bad idea. On paper, it seems very fun because for a guy like Alexander Johnson, we know he's very effective in terms of being able to read plays, diagnose it, and get into the backfield, tackles for loss. He's very good at that. You want to blitz him a lot. I think Justin Sternad's more of that coverage guy that you can rely on. Now, he still has to improve a little bit, and he's still in the process of learning everything that the Broncos defense needs of him in that position. Now, he is playing Josey Jewell's role when he is getting reps there. So being that Mike backer, you have to learn a lot of those responsibilities. Alexander Johnson's been playing a lot of the will, which is the weak side backer. So we'll continue to watch how Josh Watson, Justin Sternad, and Curtis Robinson do in Broncos camp, specifically at the inside linebacker position. But this upcoming weekend is a special time, I think, for Broncos country. In the last couple of years, we've started to see a little bit more recognition for the Broncos when it comes to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Peyton Manning, Steve Atwater, and John Lynch will be inducted into the Hall of Fame this weekend. I can't wait to just sit down and watch it. One thing for me that I always love reflecting on is going back and listening to these players tell some stories. Now, it's going to be a little bit different this year because you're going to be seeing two classes be nominated and obviously go through the whole ceremony. So from what the reports have suggested, each person that's getting inducted, each player that's been inducted in the Hall of Fame, they will get about 6 to 7 minutes total to talk about things, to give their speech. I feel like You got to open it up a little bit more. I don't care if we have to stay there 5 hours. Let everybody give that speech because, yes, unfortunately, due to COVID last year, we were not able to get a full-on ceremony to honor the class of 2020 in the rightful manner. I don't think that you should cut the speeches because the speeches are probably the most impactful because it talks about the journey from Pop Warner to high school to college to the NFL and to obviously a legendary Hall of Fame career. You love hearing those stories. And, of course, we're going to hear Peyton Manning speak. Anytime Peyton speaks, we all know we're going to get some funny jabs in. And ironically enough, really kind of cool that Tom Brady's coming out to the Hall of Fame to support Peyton Manning. Obviously, those two had a very prolific rivalry and a very entertaining rivalry at that. And obviously, there was a little bit of beef there that came out in the public eye about email messages that were obtained from Tom Brady about where Peyton is at. Peyton's on his way out, and he still plans to play longer than Peyton does. I remember those emails being released as if it was yesterday, but those two have such a healthy respect for one another. They're good friends, and we actually may see them in the commentary booth someday down the road if Peyton doesn't take over an organization. But in the next maybe 5 years, we could see them both on Monday Night Football. How entertaining would that be? I know I would be tuning in for that. That'd be very fun to watch there. But outside of that, Steve Atwater, can't wait. This is a guy I watched in my childhood growing up when I was a football fan, fully invested as being a Broncos fan, and just watching Steve Atwater, the amount of hits that he could dole out, just how tough he was. And he was so cerebral, too, from that safety position. Anytime I want to go back and see a really prolific Steve Atwater game, I go back to that Super Bowl against the Green Bay Packers. I mean, he played phenomenal for the team. And I remember that friendly fire incident that happened. I was really concerned for Steve, but, you know, he's a tough guy. And obviously his legacy, I think, speaks for itself. Well deserved that he's getting to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And then let's go to John Lynch. Yes, he had a little bit of a stint in Denver. I always think you need to honor those players. If they contributed to your franchise in some way, shape, or form, you have to give them that recognition. I'll never forget that 2005 season, 2006 as well. That Broncos secondary and that defense. Champ Bailey, obviously a big focal point there. He's already in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, but John Lynch was such a feared guy, and especially going back to that Tampa Bay defense. He was a monster from the safety position. He crushed dudes. So you love that. You go back to the safety talk of guys like John Lynch, Troy Polamalu. You go back to Brian Dawkins, Bob Sanders, Ed Reed. What a prolific group of guys right there. It just gives me chills just thinking about that as a kid watching those guys play. But Broncos country, the Hall of Fame ceremony will be this Saturday. Make sure you tune in and watch it. And we'll have a little bit of recap on future episodes, Locked On Broncos, if there's anything important that we take out of their speeches. But just a tremendous honor to see Peyton Manning, Steve Atwater, and John Lynch honored as Denver Broncos in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But Broncos country, coming up here in just a moment, we're going to get to your questions in our mailbag episode. The Broncos had Thursday off. That doesn't mean that we have a day off. We answered Broncos fans' questions. We're going to do that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, folks, I have to tell you about Built Bar. And they are the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. And Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar. When we talk about protein bars, we always like to go to things that taste great and are also healthy for you. Well, Built Bar is the perfect combination of both. They feature 9 amazing, delicious flavors. My personal favorite, peanut butter brownie. They also have salted caramel. They have double chocolate, raspberry, cherry barcia, and they also have lemon almond cheesecake as a special time offer flavor over there, built.com. And I mentioned that Built Bars are the best tasting protein bars because the bars, they're covered in 100% chocolate. They're soft, they're easy to chew, and they're also healthy for you. They contain 17 grams of protein, only 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. That's why I rock with Built Bar. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to get your hands and your taste buds on a box of Built Bar today by going to built.com. And when you go to checkout, use promo code LOCK15. That's going to get you 15% off your next order. Once again, promo code LOCK15 is going to get you 15% off your next order at built.com. Getting into our mailbag portion of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. As a reminder, the Broncos had Thursday off. Friday and Saturday will be grueling days of practice, days 3 and day 4 in the pads. The physicality will ramp up a little bit. We're continuing to monitor the storylines. Can the Broncos offense shake things off after turning the ball over in the red zone period on Wednesday? That'll be an ongoing situation we're continuing to monitor in the ongoing quarterback competition, not to mention tight end 3, the ongoing battle you have between Sean Byer, Austin Fort, Andrew Beck, and Eric Saubert. It's a fun position battle to watch. Right tackle, Calvin Anderson, Bobby Massey. Really between those two players at this point in time, there's a lot to look forward to outside of just the quarterback position in general. But I want to get to our Broncos mailbag questions here from some listeners on Twitter in Broncos country. And the first one is going to start off from Randoke77. He says, anything surprise you yet? Well, to be honest with you, nothing really surprises me too much in the training camp practices outside of maybe a guy just absolutely tearing it up. No surprise there because some of the reports, obviously, with Patrick Surtain, how he's been playing, not a surprise if we go to his body of work at Alabama, what the expectations are for him. I'd say maybe a surprise just to see how Courtland Sutton has risen up so quickly, has gotten a little bit more confidence back under him in the last couple of weeks. I think that's a good sign for the Broncos when it comes to that week 1 matchup against the New York Giants. But outside of that, surprises are really going to come after preseason game number 1. Now, we may see some surprises coming up in joint training camp practices with the Minnesota Vikings this Wednesday or Thursday when the Broncos are on the road. Outside of that, they're more than likely, I think, going to be off on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. They'll have to travel in between there to Minnesota for these joint practices. But outside of that, I don't think that we can be surprised necessarily until we see some action in the preseason. So next Saturday when the Broncos play the Vikings at 2:00 p.m. Mountain Time, we're going to see who's going to surprise. For me specifically, I'm looking at special teams players. How do the Broncos kick coverage units look? How does the punt return coverage look for the Broncos when they're defending against the team that's returning if the Broncos have to punt away? Can the Broncos set up some decent punt returns or kick returns? And do they obviously manage their blocks if there's an extra point? Do they not let anybody through? These are things I look at from that standpoint. Defensively, are there any players, young guys that are maybe vying for a third spot on the depth chart or maybe a starting role that are going to make some plays to help increase that value, maybe make an argument for them to make the team? Now, everything is ongoing for teams, for Vic Fangio and the coaches, the personnel department, and the front office in terms of evaluating the whole entire roster. It's not just what you look at in terms of the practice day-to-day. That has a little bit of a factor into how Broncos coaches determine who's going to make the active roster. There's a guy like Rojesterman Ferris who had 2 interceptions in 3 days of Broncos camp, but can he do it in a game against another team? Now, if he makes plays in the preseason, I think Ferris might have a really good opportunity to solidify himself on the Broncos roster. He's been a nice little surprise in camp, and it's only been a week, right? But then again, we see this happen all the time where a player will have a really good training camp, but then when the game comes, they may crap the bed. And, obviously we don't want to see that happen for any player, but the reality is there's difference between guys who could turn it on in practice versus turn it on in games. So for me, going through the offense and the defense and the special teams, evaluating how they do in the game against the Vikings and then carrying that over, guys who made mistakes in game 1, can they make some adjustments going into game 2, game 3, so on and so forth, as long as they're still on the roster? Those are the things that I'm looking at. And then I'll have a more definitive answer for you next week when we're having this conversation after the Broncos' first preseason game. And then on Saturday, after they have their preseason game, that following Sunday, they're going to have a practice. So the day after they have the game, they're going to have a short walkthrough practice, maybe just to get the soreness out. I know after games, one thing our coaches always had us do, they had us show up, get that lactic acid out of our body. So that might just be what the Broncos do, a walkthrough scenario there on that Sunday. But outside of that, we're one step closer to Broncos football. But Rando, thank you for that question. Let me revisit that coming up after the first preseason game, my friend. But I appreciate you taking time to put that out there. Our next one comes in from Polish Filipino. He says, is there an area of the team where depth concerns you? Also, do the Broncos want to sit on remaining cap space, or do you think that they intend to use it? These are some great questions here. To answer your first part in terms about any concerns regarding depth at certain positions, as of right now, no. I think that the Broncos, I think what George Payton and this team have done, they have looked at positions that need depth or need competition, and they've added it. Now, Savion Smith is another cornerback the Broncos had added onto the roster this past week. That is just a filled cornerback room right now. But I think the premise of that move is to get some guys some playing time in the preseason. I think that we'll see a little bit of the starters. I think we'll see a little bit of Darby. We'll see a little bit of Fuller and Callahan and Patrick Surtain. But I think a majority of the preseason, specifically in games 2 and games 3, we're going to see guys like Rojesterman Ferris. We're going to see guys like Smith. We're going to see the other guys on the back end there. I don't think Asang Bassi will be ready for the preseason, but the Broncos want to bring in as much depth as possible so they don't have to throw their starters out there in preseason games outside of the few snaps that they will be designated to take. So keep an eye on that. Now, in terms of the cap space, I believe the Broncos right now, they sit at second in the NFL in available cap space remaining. I don't think that they're going to try to spend it. Now, if they do spend it, I don't think they're going to go out there and trade for a player. I don't think that they're going to go out there and try to sign a guy who's a free agent. They may sign a couple of guys, but they'll be lower level deals that don't really impact the Broncos salary cap in any way, shape, or form. However, I do think that we will see a couple of contract extensions happen for the Broncos this season. Keep an eye on Bradley Chubb. Keep an eye on Courtland Sutton. It's something that George Payton has said that he wants to get done this season rather than risking losing them to free agency at some point. But I think for Courtland, you just want to see how he's doing so far, how he's attacked this offseason, how he's looked so far in training camp. I think the Broncos will offer him that extension in season. We'll see that deal done. I think the same thing as well for Malik Reed. I think he's going to be in line for an extension here with the team. And a lot of it depends on those conversations that they have behind closed doors as to what his role may be in the future. So we'll see where things are at. Von Miller, obviously on a 1-year deal. The Broncos don't want to spend unnecessary cap space now when they want to maybe preserve. And we know that the salary cap will increase in 2022. So the Broncos will have more flexibility to maneuver some deals, backload some money to where you maybe convert some of those into signing bonuses. You still have more available salary cap space. If the Kansas City Chiefs can negotiate that with Patrick Mahomes' contract, sign all these offensive linemen here in this offseason and a lower salary cap year, I think that the Broncos will have enough space to be able to maneuver and make great things happen. I think that they really want to keep the core of this team intact. So that's something that I'm keeping my eye on there. So I don't think that they're going to be spending any money anytime here soon. So that's a great question, my friend. Thank you so much. Well, Broncos country, coming up here in just a moment, we're going to continue answering Broncos fans' mailbag questions on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But before you do that, folks, I just want to remind you to check out the Locked On Today podcast on your favorite audio podcasting platform, brought to you by Peter Bukowski, who goes through all of the professional sports, all the sports in the world. You have USA Basketball right now. They are set to appear in the gold medal game. Peter Bukowski goes through what Team USA could do to win this game and what's on the line as well, not to mention everything in the NHL, MLB, and all the NFL action that is ongoing. That is the Locked On Today podcast. You can get that on your favorite audio podcasting platform. Jumping into the fourth quarter action of today's episode, Locked On Broncos, continuing with our Broncos mailbag from the avid listeners all across Broncos country. And in the future, if you ever want any of your questions answered here on the show, all you have to do is send me a tweet on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL. You can DM me the tweet. You can email me, Cody at CodyRoarkNFL.com. We'll be happy to answer that. I'm very excited about Sarah Bettinger being able to join us here beginning next week, August 9th, the debut episode of Sarah's full-time start as one of the co-hosts here, Locked On Broncos. But with that said, continuing on with our questions, CG Orange Crush comes in with the next one, asking, the depth at corner that we've acquired, I get that there's injuries and you never know what could happen, but you think other position groups could use the depth instead, like the offensive line or somewhere else. The Broncos have a lot of offensive line depth right now. Now, you got a couple of guys that are banged up. Obviously, you lost Cody Conway early on in the week due to a torn ACL. But for the most part, the Broncos have a very, very big position room when it comes to the offensive line. Now, I look at this team. I look at other positions. Safety has a lot of depth. Wide receiver has a ton of depth. Tight end has pretty good depth right now. The offensive line has pretty good depth. Running back is a full room. Quarterback, you have 3 guys. And I think that the Broncos are okay with that between Teddy, Drew, and Brett Rippon. That, to me, signifies good depth at the quarterback position. Defensively, I look at outside backer. Maybe. But you have guys like Peter Tamupinu, Andre Minson, undrafted rookie free agent out of Vanderbilt that are vying for maybe that 4th outside backer spot. You have Jonathan Cooper. You have a lot of options there. Inside linebacker, I think the Broncos have quite a bit of options there as well. So I don't think necessarily right now there's any one position that needs more depth than the other. I think the Broncos have as much depth as they need for all the positions that they do have on their team. But that is a great point there. CG Orange Crush on Twitter. Tim Wins is up next. He says, how good can this pass rush be with the emergence of McTelvin Agim and continued development of Draymond Jones? This is a good question. Now, here's the deal. I think that the more that Mike Purcell is out with this ankle injury, and, I think that the Broncos will enter this season cautious with him. They're not going to put him into any situations that maybe he's not ready for. He had that Liz Frank surgery last year. He had the hardware removed this offseason, sprained his ankle first week of training camp. You're going to run into things like that. So you may run into a few times where maybe he runs into a setback or a little bit of an obstacle, specifically with his foot. And I think that the Broncos want to protect that investment because they invested in a 3-year contract extension with him last season. So I think for Purcell, it gives more opportunities with him kind of being in there. I wouldn't be surprised if the Broncos rotate both McTelvin Agim, Mike Purcell, and even Marquise Spencer a little bit at the defensive tackle position. There is Shamar Stephen as well, a veteran player that came over from the Minnesota Vikings this offseason. But outside of that, I'm going to focus on Agim. I'm going to focus on Draymond Jones, Tim, as your question was really aimed about those 2 guys. Draymond Jones is expected to be the starter at the other defensive end spot opposite of Shelby Harris. He's come along really well. And Von Miller's had high praise talking about just how fast he is and how strong he is. And he's played with a lot of really good, dominant defensive linemen. And he had a lot of high praise there for Draymond Jones. So can Draymond maybe be that next Malik Jackson, but even better than what Malik Jackson was, a guy who will get his hands up and knock passes down? Shelby Harris does that really well already, but can he be that guy that causes the interior penetration when you stunt him in certain tackle and twist stunt packages that the Broncos, they do employ? We'll see how often Vic Fangio decides to go with that. But I'm very excited about Draymond Jones. McTelvin Agim is going to be a player that continuously gets reps in that rotational role. I think he's going to make the roster, and I think he'll play that role a little bit. He'll be that impact player that maybe DeMarcus Walker was last year, but he has a chance to. I don't even want to set that as his ceiling. I want to set that as his floor. He can come in and be that rotational impact guy, and I think we'll see a lot of that. He's really strong, but he could work a little bit on his pass rush moves, but he's been disruptive so far in Broncos camp. I don't think you could ask for anything more than that, so that's something we're going to keep our eye on. That's a great question, Tim. Mile High Memories is up next. He says, why the heck is Brett Rippon getting so many reps in camp? Shouldn't these valuable reps be used to help one of the potential starters? It seems like a real waste of valuable practice. If the number 3 quarterback is starting for whatever reason, it seems like things have hit the fan and can be dealt with then. Well, here's the deal. I understand the frustration. That's what people are saying. You have people saying that Vic Fangio, Ed Donatell, Pat Shermer, these are uninspiring coaches. You have a lot of people out there on Twitter saying that. But also in terms of Brett Rippon getting reps, guess what? He needs those reps because it doesn't matter if you have Drew Lock or Teddy Bridgewater. Anything can happen. I think we all saw that last year when the entire Broncos quarterback room was wiped out because of COVID protocols, and they got taken away from a game. That's where Kendall Hinton had to step up. The Broncos obviously have better practices. They're at 90% or above in terms of their vaccination rate. Outside of that, you never know what can happen. So Pat Shermer, I think, said it best this week in one of his post-practice pressers is that you have to have guys ready. Like, for even if it's your number 3 quarterback, Brett Rippon has to be able to be ready to, if something were to happen, to be able to go in and lead the offense at the same exact pace maybe that a guy like Teddy Bridgewater or Drew Lock would do. Not to say that he's going to have those expectations, but if a worst-case scenario event happens, you want a guy to be ready. And Brett Rippon, I think, was ready to go in last year. Obviously, he showcased that a little bit. Yes, he had the 3 picks against the Jets, but for the most part, Brett Rippon looked pretty decent in terms of the overall playbook, being able to move the Broncos downfield on the offensive side against the Jets and against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers when he came in late in that game to replace Jeff Driscoll. My point is, regardless of what happens here in 2021, Teddy Bridgewater, Drew Lock, one of these quarterbacks will not be on the roster. Brett Rippon is viewed internally by the Broncos organization as maybe being a long-term backup, and they've loved that he's embraced his quarterback leadership role in that room alongside Drew Lock and Teddy Bridgewater. Wide receivers, tight ends, the offensive line, all of these guys resonate and connect really well with all 3 quarterbacks. And so for Brett Rippon, you look at him as the long-term backup option with the potential, obviously, to be in that role. Teddy Bridgewater, I don't think that we're going to expect Drew Lock or Teddy Bridgewater, one of these guys, whoever wins the quarterback competition, they'll be the guy this year. But the other guy, I don't think you can expect to be the backup long-term. Brett Rippon is viewed differently inside the locker room, and they want to keep him. They want to get him up to speed. So I have no gripes about it because practice reps are divvied up very effectively by coaches and may not appear that way to the spectator's eye, but the coaches know what they're doing. And so I think that Broncos fans have to trust what the coaching staff has plans for and who they get reps and why they give reps to them. There's a lot of things that they run script-wise that we as media members, we have no clue about. So I'm glad that Pat Shermer did touch on that a little bit earlier on this week. Our final one comes in from Johnny Teixeira. He says, is there a scenario where Locke does not start week 1? I feel like we have invested too much time and effort to where it shouldn't matter how much they perform in training camp. Locke should be the number 1 week. Locke should get the week 1 start against the Giants and should start until he's proven to be incapable. Now, I think that we've heard a lot of different things, right? Coach speaking. One interesting note from Pat Shermer this past week that he said is that we see the best version of Drew that we've ever seen. To me, I don't know if that really indicates. I feel like it tells me that maybe Pat Shermer views Drew Lock as the guy. I might be reading way too much into that comment, but I think that the Broncos will give Drew Lock every opportunity to be the starter week 1. And if it doesn't work out, if he's not that week 1 starter, if the Broncos decide to play it safe with Teddy, or if Teddy's just playing a lot better in the preseason, I think that the Broncos roll with the best option that gives them the chance to win games. Now, I still think that Drew Lock can do it, but as of right now, we don't know. We have to see a little bit more in the preseason action to really determine that. And if Drew comes in and lights it up in 2 out of 3 preseason games, I think that it's easy to say he might be the guy. Now, if Teddy Bridgewater, lights it up in 2 out of 3 preseason games, and it really boils down to that 3rd preseason game for both quarterbacks after 2 weeks against the Vikings and against the Seahawks, that Rams game is going to be so interesting. We may not even see Brett Rippon play at all, but it may be between Drew and Teddy there to see who gets the starting job. And Vic said it could carry all the way out to leading up to kickoff week 1 against the New York Giants. But my personal opinion, I think that the Broncos, they give Drew every opportunity, which so far they are. Let him be the guy that starts week 1 if he has a really good preseason, and then see where you go from there. See if he improves and see if he helps you in the regular season. If not, the Broncos will be looking at a quarterback after the 2021 NFL season. But Broncos country, thank you so much for tuning into today's episode, Locked On Broncos. That'll do it. Make sure you follow this podcast on your favorite audio podcasting platform, Apple Podcast, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or the Odyssey app. Not to mention, make sure you hit that subscribe button here on YouTube so you can get access every single day to daily Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage on the team that you root for on Sundays. We always try to bring an objective point of view to everything that's happening in Dove Valley from the coaching standpoint, from the player standpoint, from the X's and O's. You get that all here on this podcast in 30 minutes or less. But with that said, Broncos country, I'm Cody Roark, host of the show. Broncos back at the practice field on Friday. We're going to have complete coverage over here, Lockdown Broncos on YouTube and also on your favorite audio podcasting platform, not to mention on Saturday as well. But with that said, Broncos country, we'll see you next time for a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.